Normandy, France, June 30 in 1944. The dawn mist hangs low over the bocage fields. Dew glistens on tangled hedgerows, as distant artillery thunders. Beyond the horizon, a rhythm that never seems to stop. In a narrow farm lane, half-shrouded in foliage, an M4 Sherman tank crouches in ambush. Its long barrel stretches beyond the brush like a spear waiting to strike. Inside, 4 men sit in silence. The gunner's hand rests lightly on the elevation wheel. The commander's binoculars tremble with each vibration of the earth. A sound grows, deep, mechanical, monstrous. Tracks grind over stone. The unmistakable snarl of a tiger echoes through the morning haze. Through the periscope, its hulking silhouette emerges. Broad turret, thick armor, German cross faintly visible under mud. The crew knows the legend. A single tiger could burn through a dozen Shermans before breakfast. But this time something is different. The commander leans forward, whispers one word, "No, fire." A blinding flash. The 17-pounder roars. The round slices through the air, strikes the tiger's frontal plate, and for the first time the beast burns. The smoke rises, and with it, a shift in power that would echo through every battlefield to come. When war broke out in 1939, the world's armies were still learning what modern armored warfare truly meant. Tanks, once experimental machines of World War I, had become the steel heart of a new kind of conflict, one defined by speed, shock, and mechanical precision. Germany understood this better than anyone. The Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941 in Poland, France, and the Low Countries were masterclasses in combined arms warfare. Panzer divisions rolled with ruthless efficiency, cutting through nations that had not yet grasped the tempo of modern war. Their tanks were not the heaviest, but their doctrine, coordination, and radio communication made them unstoppable. The Allies were slower to adapt. When American M3 Lee and early M4 Sherman tanks began appearing on the battlefields of North Africa in 1942, they were seen as a solution, fast, reliable, and easy to produce. The M4 Sherman became the backbone of Allied armored forces. Its 75mm gun could defeat most Axis tanks of the early war. It could cross rough terrain, was simple to repair, and could be built by the thousands in American factories. But as German industry responded to the defeats of 1942 and 1943, a new breed of enemy armor appeared. The Panther and the Tiger, each embodying the German philosophy of superiority through engineering perfection. The Tiger's armor could shrug off nearly any Allied shell, and its 88mm gun could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. By late 1943, the nickname Tommy Cooker, German slang for burning, Sherman tanks was grimly common among both sides. The Allies were fighting with courage but outdated firepower. In tank duels, courage was not enough. The men of the Royal Armored Corps and U.S. armored divisions faced a cruel truth. Numbers alone could not balance technology. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and later at Salerno and Anzio, Allied tank crews watched shells bounce harmlessly off German armor, only to be annihilated seconds later. Reports flowed in, desperate calls for a gun that could match the Tiger's reach. By the end of 1943, British engineers and commanders had realized that their American-built Shermans, though dependable, were outclassed. The United States was focusing on quantity, overwhelming the enemy through logistics. But for the British, fighting tigers in the narrow fields of Europe demanded something different, something that could kill a tiger head-on. In workshops across Britain, plans began to take shape for a bold experiment, one that would marry American production with British firepower. The solution lay in a weapon that already existed, but had never been mounted on a tank, the Ordnance QF 17-pounder. The challenge would be to make it fit and to make it work. In early 1944, the British Army faced an impossible equation: a reliable tank, a powerful gun, and no way to make them coexist. The 17-pounder, Britain's most formidable anti-tank weapon, could pierce over 140 of armor at 1,000 meters, enough to crack the tiger's hide, but its recoil system and breech were massive, far larger than the compact space inside a Sherman's turret. Most engineers said it couldn't be done. The Americans were already designing future tanks with bigger guns, but those would not arrive in time for the coming invasion of Europe. The man who refused to accept impossible was Major George Brighty of the Royal Armored Corps Gunnery School. Working with engineer Lieutenant Colonel W.G.K. Kilbourne, Bridie began experimenting in secret workshops, stripping, cutting, and reshaping the interior of a Sherman turret. To make room, the radio was removed from the rear of the turret and relocated to a box welded onto the back of the tank, creating the now iconic Firefly radio bustle. The gun breech had to be rotated 90 degrees to fit inside, and the recoil mechanism was shortened. Even then, the barrel was so long that it protruded far beyond the hull, threatening to betray the tank's position before it fired. Crews learned to camouflage it by painting the forward half in a lighter shade, breaking its outline among the hedgerows. By February 1944, the prototype was ready. The result was ungainly, awkward, but lethal. When fired, the entire tank lurched violently backward, but the shell it fired could punch through a Tiger's frontal armor from over 4,500 meters. The British named it the Sherman Firefly. The Americans were skeptical. They valued the Sherman's reliability, mobility, and ease of production. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department feared the Firefly's modifications would disrupt those advantages. Yet as reports of Tiger and Panther dominance grew, skepticism turned into quiet admiration. The clock was ticking toward Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. British armored units were desperate for firepower that could meet the inevitable German counterattacks. In just a few months, British factories converted over 2,000 Shermans into Fireflies. By June 1944, as the first landing craft touched the beaches of France, these modified tanks began rolling through the hedgerows. Among the countless standard Shermans, 1 in every 4 British tanks carried a long, distinctive barrel, the mark of the Firefly. German reconnaissance soon noticed the difference. Panzer commanders were instructed, if you see a Sherman with a long barrel, destroy it first. The balance of armor warfare was beginning to shift, and as the invasion advanced into the deadly maze of Normandy, the Firefly's true test awaited against the Tigers that had once seemed invincible. The human angle, fear, and firepower. For the men inside a Sherman, combat was intimate, deafening, and terrifying. The armor that surrounded them was thin, more than 50 millimeters at its thickest. When struck by an 88mm shell, the tank could erupt into flames within seconds. Crews called it brewing up. They knew the odds, but went forward anyway. Before the Firefly, tank crews approached Tigers with dread. They had to rely on flanking, ambush, or sheer luck. In many duels, their shells would bounce off harmlessly, while the Tiger's first return, shot tore through steel and flesh. Survivors carried those moments for life. The arrival of the Firefly changed more than tactics. It changed psychology. For the first time, Allied crews had a weapon that could penetrate a Tiger's armor from the front. In letters home, gunners described the 17-pounder's recoil, the thunderous crack, the flash that shook the earth. Confidence replaced despair. Firefly crews became both feared and envied. Other tankers watched for that longer barrel and its distinctive recoil. They knew that if a Tiger was ahead, the Firefly was their best hope of survival. In many platoons, Shermans formed protective screens around the Firefly, guarding it as if it were a living thing. For the men who had once felt helpless against German armor, the Firefly was redemption, a weapon that restored balance and pride. The Firefly was never meant to duel head-on in open ground. It thrived in patience and positioning. Allied commanders quickly adapted tactics to exploit its range and power. In the hedgerow labyrinths of Normandy, British and Canadian units developed ambush doctrines known as shoot and scoot. Fireflies would conceal themselves behind vegetation, their long barrels disguised with foliage or paint. Standard Shermans would move ahead, drawing enemy fire. Once a Tiger or Panther revealed its position, the Firefly would strike 1, maybe 2 shots, and vanish. Each hit counted. German crews, accustomed to shrugging off Allied shells, found themselves destroyed by a tank they had once mocked. Coordination became critical. Platoons learned to communicate targets and sight lines with precision. Infantry support was essential. In close combat, the Firefly's long gun made maneuvering difficult, but from a distance its accuracy was unmatched. By mid-1944, reports showed that a well-placed Firefly could destroy a Tiger at 500 to 2,000 meters distances, where the Tiger itself was only beginning to acquire a target. This advantage turned the tables. German armor began avoiding direct confrontation, preferring to retreat or call for air support. rather than risk another loss. In essence, the Firefly turned ambush from a desperate measure into a deliberate tactic. It forced the enemy, and for the first time, to fear the Sherman silhouette. The technological angle, the power within. The 17-pounder was more than a gun. It was an engineering marvel. Weighing nearly 2 tons, it fired an armor-piercing shell at over 2,900 feet per second. When loaded with APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds, its penetration could exceed 200 mm of steel at close range, enough to tear through even the Tiger II's frontal armor under ideal conditions. To mount such a weapon on the Sherman required ingenuity. The Firefly's recoil system had to be shortened, and the breech reoriented sideways to fit within the cramped turret. This meant the loader worked in tighter quarters. Often bruised by the massive breech block, every shot demanded precision and strength. The gun's muzzle flash was immense, visible for miles at night. Many crews limited their firing to a few rounds before relocating, yet its power was undeniable. Even near misses could spall fragments inside a target, shredding internal machinery and crew alike. What made the Firefly extraordinary wasn't just its lethality, but its balance of innovation and practicality. Britain had transformed an American tank, mass-produced for mobility and simplicity, into a precision weapon capable of destroying the most feared armor of the war. It was proof that necessity breeds innovation. The Firefly was born not from ambition, but from survival. Each shell fired from its long barrel rewrote the rules of tank warfare and forced the enemy to rethink everything they believed about Allied armor, the enemy angle, when fear changed sides. For nearly 3 years, German tank crews had grown accustomed to dominance. Their Tigers and Panthers had ruled the battlefield, confident that no Allied tank could match their range or armor. Allied shells clanged harmlessly off their plates, often serving only to reveal the enemy's position before inevitable destruction. But by the summer of 1944, something had changed. Reports began filtering into German armored headquarters. Tigers destroyed by single hits at long range, Panthers burning from frontal penetrations. Eyewitnesses described Allied tanks with unusually long barrels hidden among ordinary Shermans. At first, commanders dismissed them as exaggerations, but soon fear took hold. The Tiger's invulnerability, a cornerstone of German morale, was gone. Orders were issued to prioritize the destruction of these long-barreled Shermans. German units were briefed. Target the long gun first, and it's the Firefly. Yet, this recognition also worked against them. Firefly crews learned to exploit it, disguising their barrels or positioning themselves behind standard Shermans. When the enemy opened fire on the wrong target, it was often their last mistake. Psychologically, the Firefly cut deep. Veterans later admitted that they began to feel hunted, a sensation alien to crews once worshipped as armored predators. A single Firefly in concealment could paralyze entire German platoons with uncertainty. The same soldiers who once laughed at the Tommy cooker now feared it. Proof that the tide of armored warfare had turned. The leadership angle, vision, resistance, and resolve. The Firefly's existence was not the product of a single decision, but a series of arguments across Allied command. The British wanted immediate solutions. The Americans preferred to wait for next-generation designs like the T-26 Pershing. Logistics officers protested that modifying Shermans would slow mass production and complicate maintenance. But men like Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Sir Percy Hobart of the British 79th Armored Division understood the urgency. The invasion of Europe could not rely on numbers alone, not when the Germans could counter with Tigers, capable of halting entire offensives. Montgomery pushed for the Firefly's rapid deployment despite American reluctance. Behind closed doors, he argued that no infantryman should advance against a Tiger without a Firefly behind him. His insistence ensured that by D-Day, British and Canadian armored divisions had at least one Firefly for every troop of 4 tanks. Eisenhower, focused on maintaining Allied cohesion, allowed the British to proceed, recognizing the strategic benefit, even if the Americans themselves were slow to adopt the weapon. The Firefly thus became more than a tank. It became a symbol of Allied cooperation under pressure. American industry provided the canvas. British engineering provided the brush. Together, they painted a solution that no nation could have achieved alone. The moral and industrial angle, adaptation as strength, war often rewards flexibility more than perfection. The Firefly was not the most elegant machine, nor the most comfortable. It was a compromise, a patchwork of ideas forged under necessity. Yet that compromise embodied the Allied spirit better than any other tank of the war. German engineers had pursued perfection, complex machinery, intricate optics, powerful guns, but each Tiger or Panther consumed time, resources, and fuel. By contrast, the Allies built systems that could adapt, evolve, and multiply. The Firefly was the ultimate expression of that philosophy, a transformation born not in luxury but in urgency. Its success also carried a moral weight. For soldiers who had once faced overwhelming odds, it proved that ingenuity and cooperation could overcome even the most fearsome enemy. The laughter of German tankers, mocking the toy Shermans, was silenced, not by sheer might but by innovation. By the end of 1944, every Tiger commander knew its name. The Firefly had turned the Allies' greatest weakness in undergunned tanks into a weapon of terror, and as the front moved deeper into France, that new fear would be tested in blood, smoke, and steel. The next encounters would prove whether the Firefly's legend was truly earned or merely beginning. Normandy, July 1944. The hedgerows of northern France had become a green maze of death. Each lane, each field, each farm was a trap. German armor hid behind the thick walls of earth and vegetation, waiting for advancing columns to expose themselves. The Tiger and Panther, slow but powerful, were kings of this landscape. Until now. In the weeks following D-Day, British and Canadian tank crews began using their new Fireflies in combat. The results were shocking. During Operation Goodwood, southeast of Caen, British armor moved against the formidable 21st Panzer Division and elements of the 1st SS Panzer Corps. Tigers lurked beyond the grain fields, confident in their supremacy. But as the first volleys were exchanged, something unfamiliar happened. Tigers exploded under the first Allied shots. From over a kilometer away, hidden among ordinary Shermans, Fireflies picked off German armor with uncanny precision. In one engagement near Buren, a Canadian Firefly commanded by Lieutenant Gordon Robertson destroyed 2 Panthers in under a minute, both from frontal hits. In the chaos, German infantry began to retreat, unsure what weapon had pierced their ironclad beasts. But the defining moment came weeks earlier. On June 13, 1944, at the now famous Battle of Villers-Bocage, the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, when they faced the feared Tiger ace, Michael Wittmann, whose tank rampaged through British columns, destroying more than a dozen vehicles in mere minutes. His name became legend, proof of the Tiger's invincibility. Yet the legend would not last. Days later, near Saint-Aignan-de-Crémenil, Wittmann's Tiger met its match in a concealed British Firefly from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Sergeant Joe Ekins, a gunner who had never before faced a Tiger, fired 3 rounds in quick succession. One struck the Tiger's hull. Another penetrated the turret. The explosion that followed was seen for miles. Wittmann and his crew were killed instantly. For years, historians debated which unit fired the fatal shot. But the fact remains. It was a Firefly that ended the career of Germany's most famous tank ace. After Villers-Bocage, German crews began whispering new words, Achtung, Firefly, over their radios whenever they saw the long glinting barrel through the smoke. In that summer of 1944, the unthinkable happened. The Tiger, once the terror of the battlefield, became the hunted. The tide of armored warfare was turning, one flash, one kill, one burning Tiger at a time. By late summer 1944, the Allied advance through Normandy had transformed from a desperate foothold to a relentless push. What began as small skirmishes among hedgerows evolved into vast armored clashes, stretching from Caen to Falaise. In those rolling fields, the Firefly earned its reputation, not through propaganda, but through results written in smoke and steel. In Operation Totalize and the closing of the Falaise pocket, Fireflies were no longer rare curiosities. They were leading ambushes, destroying Tigers, and cutting off retreating German columns. At Saint-Aignan, a troop of Fireflies from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry destroyed 5 Tigers in a single engagement. Each kill was confirmed by ground infantry, the monstrous wreck still smoldering hours later. These were not isolated successes. Across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, reports repeated the same story. A single Firefly, carefully positioned, could decide the outcome of a battle. The ratio was astonishing, 1 Firefly could knock out a tiger or panther before those German tanks could even bring their guns to bear. German command struggled to respond. The Tiger's once invincible armor was now a liability. Too heavy, too slow, too demanding of fuel and maintenance. Panthers fared better, but their confidence was shaken. Luftwaffe air cover, once a protective blanket, was largely gone. Allied air supremacy left German tanks exposed during daylight, while the Fireflies struck from shadowed ridges and hedgerows. In August 1944, during the final breakout at Falaise, Canadian and Polish armored units used Fireflies to devastating effect. One after another, German Tigers and Panthers burned in the narrow valleys, mechanical giants falling under the precision of a gun the Germans had once dismissed as laughable. Crews recalled seeing the panic in German movements, tanks reversing wildly, trying to shield themselves behind wrecks of their own making. The Firefly's shell hit so hard that it often penetrated both sides of a tank, leaving a single smoking line of exit where the round had torn through armor, crew and machinery in one motion. For the Allied tankers who had lived through years of inferiority, it was vindication. The Firefly had given them equality, and then superiority. Each battle was proof that courage, coupled with innovation, could overcome any myth of invincibility. By autumn, the Firefly was more than a weapon. It was a statement. The Germans, who had once mocked the Sherman as a toy, now feared even the rumor of a long barrel glinting in the distance. In the dying days of 1944, as snow began to fall over the Ardennes and the war entered its final brutal stage, the Firefly continued to hunt across the European countryside, quiet, patient and merciless. The laughter that had once followed the Sherman had long since vanished, replaced by the crack of the 17-pounder and the thunder of collapsing steel. By the end of 1944, the impact of the Sherman Firefly on the European battlefield was undeniable. Though the tank itself was a modification of an existing design, its psychological and tactical effects were profound. For Allied crews, the Firefly restored confidence. For the Germans, it shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding their armored divisions. Statistically, the numbers were striking. While the Sherman had always been reliable in mobility and logistics, the Firefly's 17-pounder gave it a killing power that rivaled the heaviest German armor. Reports from the Normandy campaign noted that a single Firefly could destroy multiple Tigers or Panthers in a single engagement, often from long range where the German tank could not effectively respond. In many instances, small units equipped with Fireflies held entire sectors against superior German numbers, creating a tactical multiplier that went far beyond raw production figures. The British production of Fireflies was relatively modest and around 2,000, converted by the end of the war, but their influence far exceeded their numbers. They were integrated into every major armored unit in the British and Canadian forces, typically one per troop of 4 tanks. Commanders quickly realized the importance of protecting these tanks. Standard Shermans formed protective screens around Fireflies while infantry covered their flanks. The long barrel of the 17-pounder became a symbol on the battlefield, a warning to friend and foe alike. German armored units were forced to adapt. Standard tactics that had relied on the Tiger's frontal invulnerability no longer applied. Ambushes, long-range fire, and careful positioning became necessities. Officers repeatedly instructed crews to prioritize Fireflies in engagements. The myth of the Tiger as a battlefield god began to erode. By the end of the summer, German commanders were openly frustrated in reports, describing Allied tanks with unusual guns, capable of defeating their heavy armor. The Firefly's effect was not only tactical, but also psychological. For Allied crews who had survived countless encounters with German armor, it instilled a newfound sense of empowerment. Soldiers who had once seen death in every shadowed field could now face the Tiger with calculated aggression. Letters from the front, diaries, and post-war memoirs recount the transformation. Where fear had ruled, respect and cautious confidence emerged. And yet the cost was never far from memory. Firefly crews still faced high casualty rates, and each tank destroyed carried the weight of loss and destruction. The Firefly did not make war humane. It merely gave the Allies a fighting chance where before there had been only survival. The battlefield was changing, and the Germans could no longer assume dominance. The Firefly had proven that ingenuity could overturn brute strength, that adaptation, more than numbers, often decided the outcome of modern armored warfare. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the Firefly's legacy on the battlefield became increasingly clear. German armored forces, once feared as invincible, were systematically being neutralized. The Tiger, which had inspired awe and terror, was no longer untouchable. Firefly crews recorded countless engagements in which their long-barreled Shermans destroyed tigers and panthers from ranges the Germans had assumed safe. In reports from the Falaise Pocket and later the Battle of the Scheldt, commanders noted that German tank losses directly attributable to Fireflies were disproportionately high compared to their small numbers. Strategically, the Firefly's presence allowed Allied commanders to plan operations with renewed confidence. British and Canadian armored divisions could spearhead assaults on fortified positions with reduced fear of being decimated by heavy German tanks. This advantage was not just in firepower, but in planning and morale. Infantry and artillery knew that at least one tank in each formation could punch through the thickest enemy armor. German forces, meanwhile, scrambled to adapt. They introduced heavier guns, reinforced armor, and tactical retreats to avoid Firefly ambushes. But these measures were largely reactive and came too late. Logistical limitations, fuel shortages, and the relentless pressure of Allied advances meant that no countermeasure could restore the Tiger's dominance. The industrial implications were significant as well. The Firefly demonstrated the value of modifying existing designs rather than waiting for entirely new machines. British ingenuity had converted a toy tank into a battlefield equalizer, proving that adaptation and clever engineering could match and even surpass raw technological superiority. This lesson would resonate in post-war tank design, influencing the development of vehicles like the Centurion, which combined mobility, armor, and powerful guns in a balanced package. The human cost, however, remained immense. Even with Fireflies, casualties were high. Crews had to endure cramped interiors, punishing recoil, and the ever-present threat of ambush. Survivors often described the combination of fear and exhilaration. One moment facing the lethal threat of a tiger, the next, delivering the decisive shot that could save their comrades. By the end of the war in Europe, the Sherman Firefly had cemented its place in history, a symbol of adaptability, courage, and the power of human ingenuity under pressure. Where German tanks had once inspired terror, they now faced the long, precise barrel of a tank that had turned the tables on one of the most feared weapons of the war. The Firefly story, from a desperate improvisation to a decisive battlefield tool, naturally leads into the final reflection. The lessons it left behind for warfare, technology, and the men who fought within steel and smoke. The Sherman Firefly stands as a testament to human ingenuity in the crucible of war. Born from necessity, it was never meant to be graceful. It was awkward, cumbersome, and difficult to maneuver, yet it possessed a single, defining virtue, the power to change the rules of the battlefield. In its long barrel, the Firefly carried more than a 17-pounder shell. It carried hope for Allied crews who had faced seemingly invincible tigers and panthers. It carried proof that innovation could compensate for previous deficiencies. That courage coupled with engineering could topple even the most formidable machines. The battlefield is often remembered in terms of numbers. Tanks produced, men lost, territory gained. Yet the Firefly reminds us that the human element remains decisive. Morale, confidence, and the trust between soldiers and their tools can turn fear into mastery. A single Firefly hidden among ordinary Shermans could rewrite the outcome of a fight. Its legacy extends beyond Normandy. The lessons it taught, adaptability, collaboration between nations, and the power of practical innovation, shaped post-war tank design and armored doctrine for decades. It demonstrated that perfection was not always required. Sometimes the courage to improvise and adapt was enough. And for those who witnessed it, the Firefly transformed fear into respect. The laughter of German tank crews at the toy Sherman faded into silence, replaced by the cold, precise reality of a weapon that refused to yield. In the smoke and rubble of Europe, the Firefly carved its name into history, a quiet, relentless reminder that even the smallest spark of ingenuity can ignite a revolution on the battlefield. The story of the Firefly ends not with a roar, but with a lesson that in war, as in life, adaptability, courage, and innovation often outweigh sheer size and strength.